Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for March 14, 2022, the Call BoJo edition. We're going to save that story for the end of today's podcast. We begin with a story from the U.S. News and World Report, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News, that the Kazakhstan Anti-Corruption Service has detained the ex-president's nephew. The president of Kazakhstan resigned in 2019, but stayed on as head of the nation's Security Council. In January, protests over fuel prices turned violent, and he was stripped of his Security Council role. And now his nephew is in the crosshairs of the Anti-Corruption Commission. So more corruption fallout from a corrupt regime in Kazakhstan. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Mingi Sun and others reporting the Afghanistan Taliban government has appointed a man blacklisted by the U.S., the UN, and the EU to help run the country's central bank. Ahmed Zia is a senior Taliban official and financial leader sanctioned for managing funds intended for bombs and distributing money to Taliban commanders around the world. The U.S. has labeled him as a specially designated terrorist, and now he's appointed as the first deputy governor of the Afghanistan Bank. What this means, of course, is that the U.S. will have to deal with him, even though he's on the restricted list, and it's going to make it very difficult moving forward. Next up, from the New York Times, a really lengthy summary of where we are in the Roger Ng trial. Of course, Timothy Leissner has been on the stand, and the central question is, can the jurors trust that someone who has basically lied at least his entire professional career at Goldman Sachs, not only professionally but personally, to wives, girlfriends, and others he was in relationships with, whether that will be hurt the government's prosecution or not. Of course, if there's corroborating evidence, that would go a long way towards a conviction of Roger Ng, but it's difficult to understand, or rather difficult, that Leissner, former manager above Roger Ng, has tried to claim that Roger Ng was really the mastermind behind the 1MDB scandal that engulfed Goldman Sachs. And finally, we're back to our lead story, as the UK government has basically taken over the Chelsea Football Club and has announced that if you want to buy the Chelsea Football Club, please send in, call Prime Minister Boris Johnson, send fax, text, or email in your offer to buy Chelsea. So call BoJo. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.